So our next speaker today, we've got Dr. Bridget Kustin, who's going to be joining the stage, if that's okay. She is an expert, a researcher who's based here at the business school, looking at the future of wealth management. And I can't wait to hear what your research is telling us. So if you can come up and share that. Thank you.
Thank you so much, and welcome to my home institution, the Saïd Business School at the University of Oxford. It's delightful to have you here, and this will be a non-traditional day, which is the point. We are well aware of the non-traditional nature of this programming, but the urgency of the problems of the present demand nothing less than non-traditional thinking. So, there we go. It's difficult to talk about wealth because the story has already been told and told and told again, and we think we know what the issues are and what the stakes are. It's easy to slip into that voyeuristic gaze, to really revel in the schadenfreude of seeing what happens when the wealthy and powerful are brought low by all of the problems that wealth can bring. But if you're anything like me, the real question when you watch Crazy Rich Asians is that multi-generational wealth in Hong Kong or is it in Singapore? We are never told, right? The glaring absence in all of this, in all of these family dramas, is the role of the professional service provider, because multi-generational fortunes cannot endure without the work of many of the people in this room, whether it's tax planning, whether it's being a trusted advisor, whether it's advice, whether it's accountancy work, whether it's legal services. This cannot exist without that list of professions and roles. Now, we do get a glimpse of the value of those roles when it comes to the fool. Famously in King Lear, the fool is known as the one person that Lear is willing to listen to, the one person who can deliver hard truths, the one person who can hold up a mirror. Dr. Alan Parfit in Succession, for those of you who've seen season 1, had a less noble role. He ended up bloodied in the teeth. Show of hands, anyone seen Succession? Right, I'm not the only one invested in pop cultural representations of the demographic that many of us work with, count ourselves as belonging to, or study for the academics in the room. Now, I'm up here because Stephanie Brabi of the Good Ancestor movement reached out because she encountered a document that I had prepared called A Toolkit for Responsible Ownership. I wrote this under the auspices of the Ownership Project here at Oxford Saïd. This is on the internet, you can Google it. The Ownership Project was a 4-year study of family businesses with revenue above $1 billion a year, and they brought on me, an anthropologist, to explain what the quantitative data was indicating, but wasn't showing explanations as to why. That is to say, we were seeing quantitatively a gap between the ESG performance of multi-billion-dollar listed family businesses versus a gap between that ESG performance versus their own very positive narrative about what their businesses were accomplishing. So they turned to me, the anthropologist, and said, Bridget, figure it out. What's going on? Now, for those of you who aren't familiar, anthropology is the study of people. The technical term for our signature method is participant observation, also known as deep hanging out. Literally, not a joke. Deep hanging out. The idea being that we dress to fit in and to be unremarkable. We present ourselves so that people start to speak freely around us and we can understand their grammar, their internal logics. Now, this method can work in any number of settings. Before studying family businesses with revenue above $1 billion, I was studying wealth management at the lower end of the income spectrum, and specifically the consumer professional interface when it came to Islamic microfinancing. So I lived in a rural area on the border with Burma in Bangladesh for a year, understanding how clients interacted with their microfinance providers. Same method, different setting for the Good Ancestor movement. Exact same method, again, looking at that question of interface. How do financial service providers on the upper end of the wealth spectrum interact with their clients. Now, this is culminating in a report that you'll have access to either today or tomorrow. And a question for many of you is, yes, but Bridget, what do you ultimately think? Are you neutral? Of course I'm not neutral. I sit on the board of an organization called Millionaires for Humanity that advocates for a global wealth tax. I'm not neutral, but I have one job to do, and that job is anthropology, right? So the method requires being attentive to the logics that operate in a particular community to understand how within that bounded community, ideas make sense, even if they don't necessarily make sense outside that bounded community. Now, the report uses the term private wealth industry, which does not do justice to the rich nuances among professions and skills and qualifications that exist among private wealth practitioners. But I do think it is important to consider what it means to bundle all of those disparate labors into one category, because it allows us to understand that the industry is an integrated ecosystem. You refer clients to each other, right? Even if you're not all in the same firm, firms are increasingly offering different types of services to clients in-house. This is a great way to scale. You provide additional services to the same client base. And most importantly, I buried the lead, is that power and influence is not dependent on any particular profession, right? There will be that advisor who has no formal qualifications, but is the fool, is not the fool, is the fool in the Shakespearean sense, is the trusted advisor, is the one who can deliver the hard truths. So let's acknowledge the fact that there are different routes to power and influence. So what did I do? Over 45 hours, a truncated version of the ideal anthropological method, which is to spend 2 years immersed in a community. If any of you have, a willingness to take me on to do that, let me know, I would love to. But 45 years were spent conducting interviews with 33 professionals sourced from publicly available data sources. So Tatler Address Book, Legal 500, and Spears all give service providers the option of listing an email address. If you did, you got an email from me asking if you'd speak, right? So the idea was to work with what was in the public domain. There's the breakdown of who I ultimately spoke with, and I attended a few events as well. One that was ticketed, one was a private invite-only event. I had my own network coming from the Ownership Project, the study of multi-billion-dollar family businesses. And what I noticed was a real emerging distinction between private speech, the way people would speak to me when I said, listen, this is off the record, tell me what you didn't want to say in the interview, versus what they were willing to say, even anonymously, but with the knowledge that it might appear in a document before their peers. Now, when there's too big a gap between what people say sotto voce versus what they're willing to say publicly, this should be a warning sign to us all, because there's a lot of misinformation that can surface in that gap. And I think that's why we're here today, to start to look at what is in that gap between what people know to be true, say over drinks after work, versus what they're willing to say publicly. So what did I find, right? What are the headline anthropological observations moving within this community? Number one, that there's 3 main types of private client professionals. While boundaries are very porous and blurry, the main distinction I want to flag is this. There are some people who believe that they're being paid for their opinion. There's others who believe they are being paid expressly to not share their opinion. Now, this matters because I don't believe you can have it both ways. Everyone invoked, not everyone, almost everyone invoked the phrase trusted advisor. How can one be both a trusted advisor, but also believe it's not their job to share their opinion? This is what I mean about the kind of anthropological observations, right? It's not about pointing out what some might say is hypocrisy. It's not about saying this is right or this is wrong. It's about reflecting back to a community what they're saying and what it actually sounds like to an outsider. There was also shared frustration with an unknowing public's negative perceptions. No one likes the Sunday Times rich list. No one likes the Forbes rich list. Expletives were used in describing what people think of these lists to me. But these lists are what the public think of when they think of wealth, right? And this is frustrating. No one likes what's happening with regards to tax as a political football. shared frustration with that. But what this means is that the discussion that ends up taking airtime in public spaces is debate that is either insufficient, inaccurate, and to be very blunt, puts professional service providers on the defensive. Right? A lot of people expressed feelings of frustration that they're the bad guys. They're the ones who are doing bad things. So, again, part of this is acknowledging the emotional positions that people are coming from. Number two, tax avoidance commands attention in the public sphere, but wealth inequality does not. So when asked to reflect on tax and asked to reflect on whether public discussions concerning tax were sufficient or insufficient, to be very brief, people had a great deal to say. Please go ahead and sit down. We're all friendly here. People had a great deal to say on the topic of wealth inequality. Again, to be very candid, there was little to no commentary because people simply didn't know what it was referring to beyond, in some cases, biblical recognition of the fact of the existence of the poor and the existence of the wealthy as an immutable fact of life. Right? To live in society means that there are going to be some people who have less and some people who have more. This to me is interesting because the demographic to whom I was speaking is incredibly educated, incredibly smart, and incredibly good at what they do. And that definition of wealth inequality is not what we are actually talking about. And you're going to be hearing from other speakers today, but wealth inequality, when we refer to it, is not about an immutable fact of human existence where there will be some with less and some that will have more. This is in the Piketty vein of thinking, looking at how accumulations of wealth have been made possible in certain ways. Those ways then, in feedback loops, allow for those accumulations to become greater. And then over time, due to long macroeconomic explanations that I won't get into right now, go on to then make it even harder to undo that inequality. Wealth inequality is technical, specific, citable, data-driven, and research-based. And that was missing from the interviews. Next, doing good is mainstream, right? Many interviewees focused on the fact that their clients want to achieve more than just the preservation or creation of their wealth. But there was also widespread dissatisfaction with the doing good options that existed, right? For every interviewee who flagged philanthropy as something positive, someone else mentioned it as a tax avoidance strategy. For every interviewee who was proud of B Corps, there was someone else who said B Corps are a sham, it's a new form of greenwashing, right? The point being that the options that currently exist as forms of doing good are themselves widely viewed as debatable or insufficient. Redistribution, meanwhile, is a frontier. There were 2 interviewees who mentioned redistribution. Notably, they were 2 out of the 3 mid-career younger people in their mid-30s with whom I spoke. Only 3 people who I spoke identified as mid-career and in their mid-30s. Everyone else was senior in their roles. That being said, redistribution, generationally speaking, is on the come up, right? We know that next gens, we know that younger people are a part of emerging movements, not just good ancestor movement, but impact investing, resource generation, the impact. These are all groups that are drawing broadly from next gens. Next, it is hard to think about your role in UK or international wealth inequality when you're busy doing compliance, right? To be really frank, there is a lot to do at work. And again, these broader issues are not simply possible if there isn't bandwidth to consider them within the workday. There's an us versus them mentality. Tax avoidance is not something I do or my firm does. We don't engage in schemy practices. It's something that others do. I started questioning who is this invisible other because this bogeyman keeps getting referenced. And I never got a clear answer beyond, well, tax advisors don't have to be regulated, so we'll blame it on the unregulated tax guys. That was as clear I got as to an understanding of who this invisible other actually was. Cognitive strategies to manage dissonance because of conflicting views about wealth. Many service providers are wealthy themselves. Some people say wealth is good. Some people say wealth is a problem. I'm not here to pass judgment, but simply to flag that it was striking the number of people who pointed out their ethical side hustles. Yes, I do this, but on the weekends I do that. The number of times that the phrase, this is me trying to get my way into heaven, this is me trying to salve my own conscience, not every interviewee, right? But the number of times it gets mentioned flagged that there is cognitive work doing on to manage dissonance. Great, thank you. This is the most important finding. I really buried the lead here. 100% of interviewees believe that climate change is an urgent necessity, but only about half say that they feel empowered to bring this issue up with clients. This is the biggest, easiest actionable opportunity, in my opinion. Everyone in the room cares about this. I'm going to go out on a limb and say that, and yet not everyone is bringing it up. For more information about how to actually take both what I've said, move forward with it, and implement even more, see the report. It'll be made available to you, and I yield the floor at this time. So thank you.